Cosmic here, welcome back to the channel, and today I wanted to cover how to build a deck in Union Arena. Now, this video is going to make the assumption that you've either had a chance to play a demo at your LGS, or maybe you uncovered the tutorial app on the website, which I strongly recommend checking out if you haven't, or maybe you're watching this video and just don't know where to start. Please go check out the tutorial app on the website because it is truly the best way to learn how to play the game that walks you through each of the individual steps. Because I have heard some questions or concerns around, how to start, where to build, and I kind of want to cover all of that in one video. So by the end of this video, you should have all the information you need to build a better deck in Union Arena, as well as what cards to look out for and other things to be excited about in future sets. So with that out of the way, let's get right into it. Now, up first, if you're probably interested in Union Arena, it's because it has your favorite IP or character or video game. Of course, in the Japan version, they have things like Tekken and Tales of Arise, and for at least right now, we have some of the IPs I have shown up on the screen. So naturally, you're going to be starting this deck building process of, hey, I really like this one specific character or this one specific character of this IP, or maybe you just love everything about Code Geass and you're going to build every single deck from this set, right? So we're going to go through this process of, where do I start? What cards should I be looking out for? Building one example of a deck that's kind of more of a streamlined build process, and how in games like Union Arena, they are going to be fit around certain themes, as well as some other decks you'll notice just don't have a dedicated theme to them. They are just, hey, much more open of a deck building process. So hopefully, again, by the end of this video, you'll see both of those deck builds kind of come together and find one that's best for you for your favorite IP. Again, this is meant to be more of a general walkthrough, so this is going to be a longer video as I talk through the process, as well as cover some of like the energy breakdowns and things of that nature that people have certainly asked me for. So up front, I want to say that you'll notice we have some of the, shinier cards, but also notably, they all have this keyword called Raid. In Union Arena, at a high level, the game is about building up your energy system, building out your board, empowering up your characters into these specialized forms or evolved forms. That's, in a nutshell, what Raid is. You have to have, for example, for Gon, you have to have another Gon character, and then you raid over it. If you do not raid these characters, if you do not do this special effect, you do not get anything in this box. So you can, of course, in some scenarios, you'll have to, admittedly, just play a 4 energy, 1 action, 4K body. Because as you'll find out into certain decks, sometimes you just want a 4K body that attacks. And yes, everything does come into play rested, but if you know that you don't have the raid material in your hand, just put it in your energy line, and then on your next turn, you can promote it. Now, in this video, because I knew I wanted to cover a lot in the deck building portion, I'm only going to briefly hint at some gameplay mechanics or tips that are aligned with deck building, kind of how you want to approach the game. But I am probably going to make a entirely separate video that talks about, when do you play characters to the front line versus energy? How do you sequence your plays to make the most out of raid? How do you block correctly to make the most use out of your trigger effects, right? All of that, I think I'm going to leave either to another video or maybe overlay it with a gameplay video to where you can see some of those scenarios play out. But at least for this one, again, I just wanted to equip you with enough knowledge to build a deck so that you can get started or know what to look for when the game launches. Of course, I am recording this a little bit earlier than probably I should, but this took a lot of time to dig into this and provide all these examples. So I wanted to do this while I had a little bit more time to dig into this topic itself. So as I mentioned up front, let's start with what are we going to look at, right? As I mentioned, find your favorite IP, find your favorite character that has a raid effect, because it is also a very strong trigger effect, which is kind of the first place that I want to start. In deck building, you're going to notice as you're going throughout the set, you're going to have 3 special triggers. There's going to be special, color, and final. And I have examples here on the screen, but these are the ones that are limited to a hard 4 of in those lists. You can have 4 special triggers, 4 color triggers, and 4 final triggers. Now, the one thing I do want to mention is that you're either going to, love this or hate this about Union Arena. In especially other Bandai games, there are certain colors that, only purple has access to removal because it's BP reduction, or only red has access to hard removal because of its a BP destruction effect. That is not the case in Union Arena. The special triggers, while we do have two different examples here, generally the ones that you're going to play out of the set are always going to be the more removal focused ones. There are some cool things that you can be doing here with, I do have the Nobara example, and there's some other ones like Gojo has a couple special ones as well. But ultimately, because of how the game plays out and what I would personally recommend, start by playing the 4 that act as removal, like Divergent Fist, which is going to hit something of 5k BP or less. Now, you'll notice that they do have that trigger that when you pull them out of your life, they are going to remove something out of your character's front line. So that is something that is kind of equal across IPs, across colors, across builds, whatever, right? Those 4 special triggers, if you want to remove opponent's frontline character, and if you want to have removal in your deck, you always have access to that. Another thing that you'll always have access to is the final trigger, which is going to be an AP resetter. And what that means, again, by the time you're watching this video, hopefully you've either checked out a demo or have checked out the tutorial app, which I very strongly recommend doing. The action point resetters are very important because they extend your turns. In general, anything that allows you to provide additional actions per turn or cheat out actions or action value economy, right? As we've seen in other games like Star Wars or other Fantasy Flight games that are really heavy on the action economy, anytime you have a card that can get your extend out your turn, it's going to be a staple. And of course, in this case, with Final being one of the best triggers in the game, or arguably the best trigger in the game, even if it is extremely limited, this is something that you're going to have a 4 of in your deck at all times anyways. So if it is your last life, when you reveal it, you actually get to heal 1. Now, it's important to note this is not something like Holy Awe or anything like that, where it's at any time it's revealed, it has to be exactly your last life. And as somebody who's been playing this a lot more, that doesn't come up, thankfully, right? It doesn't come up as much as you would think, but it's still going to lead to some admittedly bad feelings when you do lose because your opponent hit a final life and you did not. It is pretty rare, but because we know through psychology and through the recency bias of negative experiences, people are more likely to remember when they got the final trigger that lost them the game instead of the final trigger that won them the game, right? So this is one that does not come up all that often, but it can really to some states where you have to plan out your turns maybe in a different way and maybe get a couple extra swings just to make sure you do not lose to that final trigger. So instead, you have to wait for that turn where you get 2 removals instead of doing just 1 removal and then trying to clear out. So the one thing I'll also note here is because this is known information and Shield games will either have a mechanic like in Kaijudo and Duel Masters where there's a bunch of different triggers and they do a bunch of different things versus something like Luck and Logic as a random reference for the video where shield triggers are more of a set item or known information, and that's what Union Arena has. So at every point in the game, you could know that your opponent is going to have 4 special triggers, 4 final triggers, and then 4 color triggers. And so the last trigger that I want to mention here is color, and I have an example of each one of those on the screen here for you. But this is something that is going to have a various effect based on what color your deck is. Spoiler, it's a color trigger. It makes sense. Now, the thing about color triggers in general is that as you are building out the deck that you're going to be playing, and as we're going to cover in this video, the color triggers are something that you just inadvertently put into the deck because they build in towards your strategy, or it's a good card that you would want to run anyways, even if it's not exactly your raid target. So the color triggers themselves, while there is a little bit of flexibility and options that you might want to pick, A or B from your specific color, you at least know that if I have this trigger in my deck, it is going to do this type of effect. However, as we think about what this looks like from, 2 or 3 years out, definitely Bandai is going to use this as a balancing factor because then if you have different archetypes that are getting support, in Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, we've already seen things like Volume 2 confirmed for JJK, Demon Slayer, etc. By having the color trigger on certain cards, you can limit how powerful that they're going to be because you have a balancing act that happens when you can only have 4 of that color trigger in the deck. So this is, again, one of the things that from an overall deck building perspective, as you're playing out the game and as you're comboing out certain plays that you want to be doing, you are always going to be aware of, oh, my opponent has 3 special triggers left. They could be in life, they could be in hand. Or if you get to a point where they're using all of their AP combo cards to extend out their turns, then you go, okay, well, now I know that it is extremely unlikely that their last final card is in their life. So now I can be more aggressive with my plays and extend out my turn to then line up to get that last life because I did impact or I saved my removal for it, right? So because they are a set item, this is something that you as a player can very strategically play around, where in other shield-based games that have these burst effects, they can be more random and more RNG driven, that, you know, oh, they hit the Holy Awe, or oh, they hit the Spark from Life, right? So it does provide a closed amount of information that you always know what you're going to be playing into. Now, that said, these are like the 3 big triggers, and there are other ones that we're going to be talking about, but in terms of the overall impact of game flow, these are certainly the big 3. Now, moving on from there is when we're starting to get into the actual deck building process. And personally, I've been watching Hunter x Hunter recently, and I'm actually very excited for the cool things that this IP can do over Bleach or JJK at set launch. So I figured I'd go through the process of building out a blue Hunter x Hunter deck, but the principles that you'll learn from this video can be applied to, again, any other IP or any other deck ultimately that you want to be building. So, of course, we're going to be starting with Killua, who has a raid ability. Now, as I mentioned with those other triggers, and again, this is kind of where I want to take a small pause, and this will be the last really gameplay type tip that I mention. You know, as you've hopefully learned from either the demo or from the tutorial app, raid is an extremely strong trigger if you as a player set up for it correctly. Now, what do I mean by that? Right? So as we know that we're going to want some number of Killua in our backline or energy line so that when we hit the raid trigger, it can go to front. The most important thing to remember about this is the raid trigger coming out of life can then be played onto the card that you saved in energy, because there are, I think, 2 cards in all of Union Arena that can swap cards from the back line, so your back line is safe. You can promote that Killua with raid, and suddenly you have an extra blocker. And then also some raid targets will have very strong on-play effects, which can then disrupt your opponent's turn. So if your opponent has those big turns where they saved, like, okay, I'm going to go for this big combo play where I do double special triggers to remove 2 threats, plus I have a strong on-play card, now you have an opportunity to get something from your life with the raid trigger. So this is one of those areas where I think it's not as obvious up front for how you want to be managing your energy line versus when to be aggressive with your front line. But again, that's getting a little bit more into the gameplay knowledge, which I'll leave for another video. But I at least wanted to highlight here because raid is something that you should have in every single Union Arena deck ever, because of just how strong not only the characters are themselves, but how important that they can be for getting them out of your life into play and then getting yourself an extra blocker when you really need it. So, of course, we're going to be starting with our raid here, and you'll notice that it is a blue card, and I have all the blue cards from Hunter x Hunter here on the side. Now, in practice, you are going to be color locked to 1 because as you need to play this card, you have to have 4 blue energy towards it. So in the future, they might have, you know, double color cards or effects that work together. But at least how the sets are designed, and you think about it from either different arcs or 2 characters who played well together, they do isolate those in each color to make it more kind of on theme and a more streamlined experience. So with that said, if we know that we want to start with this raid target, we are going to be looking at just the blue cards. Now from there, we do have all the blue cards listed as I mentioned, but then you'll also notice on this specific card, we have a trait specified slot. It's kind of a payoff that we're ultimately looking for. And also in the Hunter x Hunter set, we do have the Bomber archetype, which I'm not going to cover in this video, but there is another themed deck in blue that you could build towards. However, we know that we want to play this raid character. We know that, okay, we have to look at what the specified slot is. So that's how we're going to start building our deck. So as we're going through this, I'm going to just talk about a high level. I won't mention it every time, but here in the top right corner, you can see how the cards in deck is increasing as we go through each one of these. Now, moving on from there, we have some other cards that, you know, don't have the specified slot tag, themselves, but they do have an effect. So they get some kind of bonus or strength because of this other archetype that we already want to be building into. So we have Bisky and we have Gon here as just 2 more examples. So just from a high level deck building perspective, we're just going to say that we're going to throw 4 more of each of these in, which is going to lead us to 12. Now, again, you'll notice that neither of these have raid. They are just characters you would play out normally and then get a value from either an on play, which does trigger in the energy line, or they have to have some requirements which play in a frontline once per turn, and then you get additional effects, right? So this is going to be thinking about more of what is our top end that we're going to be looking for, what is the key strategy or the payoff for this archetype, and then how do we kind of build out the rest of the deck from there. So here's where we get more into the, hey, what are the raid targets that we're going to be starting with, right? We had mentioned up front, the way that the raid works is that you have to have another card that you can raid on top of that has the same name. There are very limited cases where I think they'll have cards that say this counts as X that you can also then use as raid. That doesn't appear in the Hunter x Hunter set, at least from my quick view of it and for what I remember. But again, to the point of we want to be focusing on Killua, so we have here the 0 cost, which means this is how you're going to build up your energy. This is something that you want to play early. So your 0 raid target is always going to be an auto include for whatever it is that your main character is going to be. Always include this card. And it's also really nice that it does have a trigger on it. So you can get it to your hand that, let's say by the worst RNG possible, the top 4 cards in your life are all the 0 drop, right? The way that Union Arena works is that you reveal the life card, you either get the trigger effect, or if it has no trigger, it just gets discarded, right? So in this case, it does have the get where you get to add it to your hand, and then this is your raid fodder you want to be doing. I do like this just from a streamlining the experience perspective, because there are some feels bad turn where you might actually just have, let's say, 2 of them in life, which means you're less likely to draw into them, but then your opponent is going to be attacking you and you will eventually find it. So the 0 costs are always good. And then, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, now we have a 2 energy cost Killua, which has a pretty good on attack effect. Draw 1 card, then put 1 card from your hand to your outside area or just your discard, right? So this is a card that we're going to want to be playing anyways because it's helping us find that raid target that we're going to be looking for, or some of those other 4 energy costed cards, just because, hey, we know that's what we want to be doing for our payoff. And then that's what you'll notice we have the first instance of our trigger. So this is where we see choose one of your opponent's frontline characters with 3,500 or less and return it to hand. As I mentioned, all of the color triggers for blue will do the same thing. And here on the right, I just gave 2 more quick examples where sometimes you'll have to actually choose between the color triggers themselves in future sets. But at least for this one, we have the Killua, which is going to go in our deck because it's our raid target that we care about, versus the Genthru group, or the bomber archetype as we just call it from the set. These are 2 cards that you'd want to be playing in the other deck, and then you'd have to ultimately choose between one of these. So that's where you get a little bit more into the choice mechanic of how I want to build out the deck and which color triggers I want to use. Sometimes it's going to be very straightforward, like it is in this example, where in other cases you'll have to actually choose between these 2, or maybe you run like a 2-2 split, which is also okay. As long as the number of color triggers in your deck does not exceed 4, you can run any combination of these 2 cards. So definitely something to keep in mind as we go to like volume 2 and volume 3 of some series, but definitely kind of put that on the back burner from now. Now let's go back to that example that we gave, right? We have a raid card that we care about. We have the other payoffs that we're looking for, which are our 4 energy costed cards, a little bit higher. And now we want to go back to the raid target that we mentioned, now that we've gotten the kind of base cards that can evo up or raid into the payoff that we are ultimately looking for. Now we got to go back to the trait specified slot. So these specified slot cards that have the trait across the top tell us that, hey, we want to include some of these cards in our deck. And this is where it gets more into the deck building process of, okay, like, which of these are good? Which of these make sense for how the deck wants to be playing? And here we know another one of those special triggers, or the special trigger, I should say, that says, hey, choose one of your opponent's frontline characters and retire it. So we know that this card can only be played as a 4 of and is something that plays out very well for this archetype. However, this one now has a special tag where only 3 of these can be put into the deck. Same thing with Plot of Beach, which is a double energy, which is very, very good, which I'll cover a little bit more later. So this is now pointing us in the direction of, okay, we know that these top 3 are just very good cards that we want to include in this deck. Now, Paladin's Necklace, the one that I'll quickly go over, is that it can strip off the top raid target, which can kind of de-level your opponent's board. But this one is more of a, you have to see it play out to really understand how good it can be outside of just drawing a card. So this is to say, hey, we're going to include this just for the sake of this video. But once you start to see how good this card itself is in terms of depending on what your opponent raids with, it's going to have different value levels, but something that I would still suggest that is worth including. And then the other one I got to give a special shout out here too is, as we talked about more of the volume 2 stuff in terms of, okay, I like this deck today, but how does this deck perform, 6 months from now? What does this look like if it gets a volume 2? And one of the things that immediately stuck out to me for just being, well, insane for what it wants to be doing is Blue Planet, but this is a set 2 card, unfortunately. This allows you to have a extra draw engine. It has a low energy requirement, so it's something that you can play early to help streamline your turns, and it has a draw trigger on it as well. So this card is really good for this archetype, and unfortunately it is a volume 2 card, but it is something that we can still, build towards or think about. Hey, I'm glad to see this volume 2 support in the future, because it means that Bandai is still looking at these older archetypes and saying, hey, we want to give them some support while also introducing a new mechanic or a new archetype or a new color to that IP that didn't have it previously. So for example, the JJK volume 2 introduced red, which was all focused around the Shibuya incident, but it also is giving support to the yellow and blue decks from the first set. So I just wanted to include this here as just a note of how these decks evolve in the future. So we know we need some number of specified slots. We know that we can only run 3 Plot of Beach. Again, really good for a double energy producing card. Angel's Breath, because it plays a character of cost 1 AP, and a lot of our cards are 1 AP, it turns out. We know that this helps us recycle in case our opponent deletes it. And then Paladin's Necklace just being great because it is a pseudo removal or a removal light type of card. So this is, again, 4, 3, and 3 that we're going to be adding to the deck. And so some of these other ones down here aren't as exciting, but something to consider for future build opportunities. So again, this is now bringing us up to 30. Now, as we talk about, okay, we have the cards that we need to raid with. We have the cards that play with the archetype that we just covered, the specified slot. We have our other 4 energy requested cards, which is kind of more of our end game. But how are we getting there, right? So we've covered the pieces of the puzzle that kind of build into our deck of what it wants to be doing. But then we also have to understand that, well, we got to build out the energy, right? Much like we see with the kind of build up strategies overall, is this game does want you to build up your energy so you can play off these bigger threats. And so that is going to start with zeros. And I've gotten a lot of questions about, what does a curve look like? How many of each energy card should I be running? Because a lot of people do come from a Weiss background. It's natural that if you played Weiss Schwarz for years, that has a more strict ratio building deck principle, where in Union Arena, it's actually a lot more open and a lot more flexible. However, as a just rule of thumb for this portion of the video, you are going to want about 10 to 16 zero cost in the deck so that you can actually play out some of those energy characters. So with that, we have Gon, which is just a staple type of card that is available in almost every IP in color, but a draw 1, discard 1. Filtering is great. It helps you find those removal pieces. It streamlines your hand. You're going to always want to be playing those in general. And then, of course, the one we're adding is Bisky, because she allows us to get back specified slot cards from our outside area to our hand, which is very strong based on some of those cards we just previewed and talked about, because we can either, replace some of our other characters that might have, we've drawn poorly. We've only seen, one raid Killua who cares about the specified slot cards, right? So Bisky is going to allow you to get back the Angel's Breath, which then plays the Killua, which then allows you to have the payoff of drawing some extra cards, right? So there's this engine that's built into the deck that plays out pretty well. And so anytime that we get the specified slot cards that are in our graveyard, she is a great way to get them back. Also to note, this card is great in the Bomber deck for that exact same reason, because you do use those specified slot cards in that other deck as well. So from an overall, what are the zeros that I want to be using if I'm playing blue Hunter x Hunter decks? Both of these cards are absolutely great and staples that I would include. Now, of course, we have the action point resetter, which I had mentioned. This is always going to be a 4 of. You want the final trigger. The action point economy is so critical in this deck. I really can't stress too much about this or overstress it. So you're always including 4 of this, right? It's just something that you're going to want to add. It's a very good, it's a staple. Put it in the deck. And so where does that put us to, right? So we talked about, we have our raid character. We have some of the other endgame pieces that we want to include that play well into the specified slots. You can see the 3 down here. We have the 1 extra special trigger that I mentioned because we can only play 3 of Angel's Breath, so we have another one here. We have the double energy builder because they are very good and very efficient at building out your energy line, so you have more room to play those raid characters out, right? So you could put now 2 kilowatt raid targets into your energy line so that your opponent can't remove them, so that if you hit that raid trigger from life, surprise, now you have 2 of them, where if you have just a lot of 1 energy producing cards, it can be pretty difficult to streamline your turns in a way that you're always going to have a Kahlua on the back line. So definitely something to keep in mind. And then, of course, we have our crown up here that we kind of have been building out for how do we get the energy online. So from this, we've already have 42 cards in the deck, which is the majority of a 50-card deck. However, that's when we get into some of the other options here, like, what makes sense. So we have a lot of top end. We have a couple cards that kind of build out the early game, but what else do we really have? So this is where we then look to the rest of the set and try to figure out what makes sense to include in our deck. So for anything that is a 1 cost or even 2 cost can definitely help fill that role. Now, while this is ultimately going to be a personal choice here and kind of how you round out those cards, the one thing that I really want to mention here is the Etta, which has the on play return one of your characters with 1 energy or less to your hand, or you have to bounce this card back. As I mentioned, the double energy is really important because it helps free up some of your back row spacing. And when you have Etta plus the Plot Beach, which is then 4 energy required, it allows you to always be able to play those 4 energy characters whenever you want with only taking up 2 slots. So the way that this works out is that you could have a front line built out, but let's say that you have to block with some of those, but you still want to be aggressive on your next turn. You have a Gon and a Kilowatt in your back line that is safe, again, from removal. You do your blocks as needed, and then you can promote those 2 and then play more stuff to your back line again, which could then be rated on if you have it. So I guess that's the last kind of gameplay thing that I'll mention, but being able to streamline your energy line and how you utilize that to plan out your attack turns is definitely one of the most important things in Union Arena as a skill to develop. And sometimes it is just going to be the case of, well, I have some extra 1s and 2s that I really didn't care about, so I'm just going to promote them to block. And that's totally fine. But generally speaking, you want to make sure you leave up some room in your energy line for those raid targets, as well as playing those 4s to the front. The last one here I'll kind of call out directly is Toryumon, which technically has that specified slot tag to it. But I just generally don't like this character at all because of the low BP, because it has to then, you spend several turns like building this up and then you have to sacrifice it to get the value out of it. So this is one of those cards where like, it's fine to leave in your energy line, kind of build up for a couple turns. You use it for a specified slot while you get some of those other cards that you can reveal to those cards, to your Gon and Kilowatt that we've mentioned. That's kind of fine, but it's not really that exciting. So you'll see here shortly that I didn't include this in my list. And instead, I really want to use the Etta for the double energy building, which can help streamline turns greatly. And the Toryumon really just kind of falls off, in my opinion, because it's a specified slot that isn't as exciting for what it wants to be doing. And just the low BP is really going to hold it back a lot. Now, the last card I have to mention, which as I was going back, I realized I didn't include in the example list, but is definitely worth talking about, is just searcher cards in general. So look at the top 7 cards of your deck, reveal something with specified slot, put the rest on the bottom and anywhere you like, right? Union Arena itself is such a low draw power game outside of spending an action point to draw an extra card every turn if you want, that naturally any card that replaces itself is something that I would classify as a good card. So this is something that once I had more time to like maybe build this and actually play test out the deck, I might change around a few numbers, but this is one I at least wanted to showcase that is a very good card to consider. So where does it leave us, right? this is the ultimate deck that I would build for this as kind of my testing standpoint. We do have the Etta because it is a double energy requirement. And then I did actually include the 2 energy guy here. It allows you to filter the top of your deck to either top or bottom, gives you a little bit more of that consistency gameplay. It's a 2 energy, so we can play it early as we need to. We just, again, wanted something else that was in the 1 or 2 category. And then also, it's actually a 3K BP, which is pretty good for how it lines up within the meta, that if you get multiple of them, you are totally fine just promoting this guy and swinging out and having a pretty good block for the early parts of the game. So I think this is one that is, again, a staple in the bomber archetype, and one that I think is going to be very good for this one as well. So as we've gone through it, you might be thinking, if you're still, this far into the video, that deck kind of built itself, didn't it, right? Like, we had a couple interesting, maybe, tech choices that we could lead to, but because of how much of it relied on the specified slot, is that all that Union Arena really is? And the answer is no. So this is where I want to bring another example, which won't be as detailed, but I want to at least showcase that there is the other archetype that I had mentioned that, hey, what if I just like this character, but there's no, special trait, or there's no special category that I have to care about? What do I do, right? So using some of those same deck building philosophies that we just covered, right? We have our 0 cost raid target. We have a secondary raid target. I would always recommend at least 2 for a deck that you're building. We have the special trigger, which is very good for Kurapika in this case. And then we have the raid target. But ultimately, overall, right, this is only going to be a very shallow shell of 20 cards that we have for the deck. And then we can kind of do whatever we want, right? So where does that leave us? Ultimately, from this point on, there are 2 directions that you could take this. One thing I didn't mention up front, because again, this kind of falls more into gameplay tips, but I'll mention here as well. You'll notice that Kurapika has 5,000 BP, where a lot of the other characters we've talked about so far were 4,000 or less. So Kurapika is not only a very good offensive card because it has impact, which is effectively trample, or again, even if your opponent blocks with it, as long as you win the battle, they're gonna take damage. So it's a piercing is another keyword that is very similar. But on block, now it has 5,000 BP that unless your opponent has a removal spell or some way to shrink the BP, their decks are most likely going to be filled with a bunch of 4Ks. So now you can just kind of wall out your opponent. So this one's extremely interesting because it's both on a great offensive and defensive card, but also because it has that impact, it's a great game ender. So here's where we see the direction of, okay, do we want other 6 and 7 cost cards which are going to have that 5,000 BP threshold? Do I want to be the more slow controlling deck that can kind of set up a wall and guarantee that you're closing out the game with impact? Or do you want to bring some of other Kurapika's friends, right? Do we want to rely on Gon and some of the other BP boosting effects to then get strategies for, hey, I want to be playing these cards early, but they need some kind of BP booster, and that's exactly what Gon wants to be doing. But then again, each one of these really don't have enough of a fully fleshed out archetype where you are going to be seeing a lot of these green cards appearing in the other's deck. So just really quickly, I want to provide 2 more examples of, what does that look like? So up first, we have more of the high-costed, lots of things that produce double energy, just trying to survive to that energy line. And you'll notice things like Killua here making another appearance that is just very strong removal. We have Neon, which is just an insane card that, again, allows you to replace itself by playing something. It's a double energy. Like, this card is just busted in general in terms of, like, cards that are good in Hunter x Hunter. Like, this one definitely takes the cake of the overall set. Love this card. Very, very good at what it wants to be doing. And then I also wanted to mention something called Step here. So Basho with the double energy here actually has the effect that because of Step, you can promote it, get an attack in, leave it as a blocker, and then if your opponent didn't remove it, or maybe you just need to promote energy on your next turn, during the movement phase, you can bring it back to your energy line and get that double energy again. So this is where now you have a little bit more flexibility in your game plan and how you want to be promoting from the energy line to the front line, freeing up some spots that way. Or if you really need the double energy production in a pinch, you kind of move it to the back line. So, and then Hisoka with just having impact and damage 2. So damage 2 just means it deals 2 damage, right? This is now where we see a lot of the 5,000 BP come into play. We have Killua, who's going to be more of a controlling piece. This is really meant to be more of just like the late game green style that we can see. And again, I'm not going to go into every card choice. I just want to provide a quick example list. And then on the other side of this, we then have other cards that, it's a 0 cost, but on retire, it's going to draw a card. And so this is actually really, really good because early game, generally, turn 1, we both play something in our energy row to build up energy. Turn 2, if we are playing a bunch of 4s and 5s, we're probably going to be spending turn 2 and turn 3 to build up that energy line. However, if we have a bunch of these 0s that can allow us to, play them in our energy line on the next turn, promote out, and then play another bunch of 0s to not lose that energy efficiency in our back line, then we can be a little bit aggressive. But not only that, this card replaces itself. So if you get multiple of these early enough in the game, they are going to be something you can attack with, deal 2 damage. Again, in Union Arena, everything restands itself at the end of its turn. And then if your opponent's trying to be aggressive back, you say, okay, I'll sacrifice both of these, draw some cards up, and now I still have that energy in my back line because I played other cards as I have, 16 0 drops in my deck. So it allows you for those more aggressive early turns. But if your opponent is able to get out multiple, 2Ks or 2500s, it can then kind of wall you off pretty quickly. However, here is where we start to see, the Leo Rio, who has the ability to get something back from your outside area. So yes, it does cost 2 actions for that turn, but then you can get back some of these 0s or some of the other green characters to streamline out your game plan once more. And then Gone, as I mentioned, we need to BP boost our way out. Gone is really great at this, which again does have a raid target here as well, that you're able to boost up some of your other characters like the Gone and like the Leo Rio to get to 4,500 or 4K so that your opponent is still losing stuff when they try to block or losing those characters. Thus, again, freeing up the way for your 0 cost to get in the last little bit of damage. And then at some point as the game is progressing, your opponent is going to say, well, nope, sorry, we got to the late game. I walled up with my 4Ks and 5Ks. And then we still have the Kurapika who says, okay, that's cool. I'm a 5K with impact. So if you're at 1 life and I just need that last little bit of reach or the last little bit of burn, Kurapika is going to be the perfect card for being able to get that last point of damage in. And then, of course, you'll notice things like we have the removal, which is just combos with Gone. We have the action point resetter, things of that nature. Again, I didn't want to go too far into these deck lists specifically, but you can have a very clear picture of now if you have a favorite character that you just want to build around, chances are you do actually have multiple deck building options within the set that is only going to get expanded on as we look to a Volume 2 or again a Volume 3. And we know again that Hunter x Hunter does have Volume 2 already out, and I would not be surprised if it does get a Volume 3 at some point down the road. Now, a couple last items I want to talk about was the energy cost breakdown. And I got a lot of requests for this, and people are like, okay, just tell me how many 0s to include. Just tell me how many 1 costs to include, right? And there's really not a good answer for that. So I took a bunch of tournament winning lists here really quickly, and I just wrote whatever archetype they were. I try to group them by, obviously this is all JJK, this is Hunter x Hunter, this is Bleach, this is Code Geass, and then this is Demon Slayer on the end. But other than green, which the big thing that I'll talk about here, right? Green having 20 plus 5 plus costed cards, but because they have a lot of those good double energy builders that I talked about, this is, more okay to run. But if I were to say like, oh, you just want to have 4 to 8, 4 costs or higher, right? That's not even correct here because you can look and some of them that have, okay, well, Lelouch has only 15. The Suzaku deck only has 4. And then you say, okay, well, if I'm running 16 0 costs, I only need 4 costs or more. And that's not true either because Tanjiro has 16 zeros and then 13 4 energy cards, right? So this is where I really wish there was something outside of like the, hey, we want to have, 0 to 16 0 cost in the deck because that's like your energy builder. And then we know we want at least 4 raid targets in our deck. And then, of course, we talked about the special trigger, the color trigger, and the final trigger. Like those have different energy points per IP. So that's not even like a straight 1-to-1. You can kind of see where it's getting a little bit muddy. So instead, what I would recommend as a best practice or kind of as you're building the decks, think about it a little bit differently. So everything that is 0 to 2 energy is going to be more of your foundations, right? This is building up my energy costs. This is building into those bigger threats that I want to be playing that are ultimately going to help me win the game. And then anything 3 energy and higher is really where you start making those big plays, right? That's where we start to see some of the removal come into play. That's where we see our raid targets. That's where we see, the impact and getting a strong on play effect. So This is where it's more of breaking down the individual IPs and the individual decks that you want to be building and kind of go from there. So yes, there are general, if I just do a aggregate across the board, I could say like, oh, you want to run 12 zeros and 4 ones and 4 twos and, whatever that else that looks like. But then that would be basically telling you to build bad decks. And that's what I really want to avoid with this video and talking more about going through the process of how you build out these decks, because it's not as straightforward as some other games that we've seen in the past. Like once you actually get into the weeds of it, you have to understand that there are going to be different breakpoints that you care, not only from an energy cost perspective or energy requirement perspective, I should say, as well as what do those raid targets look like and what cards do I want to use to help me get there. So ultimately, again, this is just a quick viewpoint. If you want to use, those example numbers that I've given, please feel free to do so. But from a general best practice standpoint, that is definitely going to be one, understand what your meta is going to be looking like, because if everyone's playing like more low to the ground, then you're probably going to want 16 zeros, regardless of what some of these numbers say, where if you know the meta is going to be a lot slower and you want some of those double energy builders instead, then you're probably going to be running a lot more of the ones and twos that provide the double energy, because it helps streamline your bigger plays and freeing up more space in your energy line. So again, it's kind of more of a think about the two sides of what you need to build into. And as I walk through that process of, hey, here's our raid target, here's the zero that goes with it, then building out the deck from there and saying, okay, well, this deck wanted me to build a lot of the higher cost cards. So, okay, then maybe I need the double energies. Or if you know that you have a lot of 4 costs or less, well, you probably only need like a single double energy card, and that's all you have to worry about, because putting one of them on the field and then letting it stay there is enough to streamline the rest of your turns. So this is where it gets more into how do I build the deck? Well, you just have to play a little bit to understand what do those higher energy costs look like and how many of like those double energies or other things that are in the deck that I need to consider. Because again, 20 of these for 5+ for the Kurapika deck is pretty insane. Now, one of the last things I want to cover is just some of the other like good cards to look out for that, are going to be not in every single color, in every single IP, but definitely things that are just generally good cards, right? So up first, we have free actions. As I mentioned, Union Arena is a action economy based game that anytime you get to do something for free or something is going to replace itself with that action point and extend out your turns, it's going to be very, very good. Much like the AP resetter that I mentioned that you're always going to be playing 4 of anyways, we then do have the free action cards with the examples here from Code Geass and Demon Slayer that say, hey, sometimes they're more restrictive, sometimes they are just a energy cost, or sometimes they are going to be a specific character cost, but they allow you to play something else for free and allow you to be a little bit more aggressive. From there, we have just my favorite cards, and I get that this is going to be either something that you play as just a one of because it frees up your back slot, or there will be cards that say on play, give something plus 1,000 BP, or draw 1, discard 1, or cycle something else, right? Or look at the top card, choose it to be top or bottom. Those are just generally good cards that as you're increasing the consistency of your deck, you really just want to be reusing some of those cards for their effects because they play into either your strategy or they help you find some of those other raid targets that you really want to be looking for. And then the other part then, of course, as I mentioned with the Gullen early on, is just the dig for combo pieces or dig for archetypes, or this is just very popular in Bandai games in general, where it says like, hey, on play, look at top 5 for this specific card. Add it to your hand, right? And then you put the rest on bottom. And what I really like about this one in particular is that it is also a double energy. So this card specifically is just absolutely cracked for that deck, but they're not always as good as this, but definitely something to just keep in mind as you're thinking about those other cards in general that will fit well into your IP. So that was a very long video, but I at least want to go really in depth into each one of these topics because I am very excited for Union Arena. And the more I play it, the more I see how some of the strategy really shines once you get past that, admittedly, pretty difficult learning curve that they have set up. So with that, let me know your thoughts if there's anything that I could have covered in a little bit more detail, or if you just have questions. I'm happy to answer them in the comments below. But other than that, my friends, look forward to more Union Arena content in the hopefully near future with some gameplay, or otherwise we're looking forward to the full release in September with some of those pre-release events. So until then, stay safe, stay hydrated, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.